The pen felt heavier than it should, as if metal could sense a lie waiting in the room. I set it down on the polished wood and listened to the soft machinery of the ceiling fan turning the Miami heat into a slow, deliberate whisper. Mr. Silver's office had the kind of old leather chairs that swallowed a man whole, and I refused to sit. 70 years had taught me that sitting makes you look ready to agree. The bay light came in hard and white. It made every dust mote seem like an accusation. On the desk lay a folder with my name, a neat label, the color of sand after rain. My daughter preferred neat labels. She had been labeling me in one way or another since she learned the word stubborn. Silver cleared his throat. "We can incorporate the updates today, if you like." "Updates?" I said, tasting the word like sour milk. My hand rested on the folder, as though I could feel the temperature of what waited inside. There was a faint smell of cologne and copier fluid, and the clock on the wall ticked in the steady voice of a man who enjoys repeating himself. I thought of Miami in the late 70s, when I first arrived and everything seemed like a deal if you held eye contact long enough. Now, every deal arrived in a folder. He slid papers out with the reverence of a priest handling relics. Standard adjustments, trust allocation, power of attorney, healthcare directives. That was the first time I saw her handwriting where mine should have been. It was a note in the margin, small and tidy, a suggestion disguised as a reminder, and the sight of it chilled me more than the office air. "We discussed this." The note lied. We had not. I didn't raise my voice. Years of Florida summers teach you to move slow around fire. "When did she come in?" I asked. He hesitated, and the fan's whisper seemed to falter. "Last week, strictly advisory. Families often. I could finish the proverb, families often turn into ledgers. The papers clicked softly as I turned them, paragraph by paragraph, a skein of words binding my years to a future where I no longer had a mouth. Halfway through the stack, a note surfaced that was not a suggestion, but a route. The percentages changed like a tide chart, quietly, predictably, inevitable if no one looked out at the horizon. That was when I realized the office smelled faintly of the sea I could not see, and for the first time in years, I felt like a man standing in water he believed was shallow. I folded the page. "Tell me something true, Silver." He gave me that careful Miami apology, the kind with good manners and no confession. "Your daughter is worried about administrative burdens. She mentioned stress, uncertainty." "Whose uncertainty?" I asked. He didn't answer, not with words. He straightened the papers until their edges aligned like soldiers, and I thought of how order can look kind to those who put the chains on. I thought of her as a child, head bent over a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table, the air from the box fan lifting the sweat-dark hair off her neck. She had solved edges first, corners second. Always the same methodical patience, always the same grip of the jaw when a piece refused to fit. She used to ask me where the last pieces went when they weren't in the box, and I used to tell her that the table kept them for later, the way a city keeps secrets between storms. A storm flickered out beyond the window. A white seam split briefly in the sky over the bay. Miami thunder does not arrive at once. It comes like a series of decisions. I placed the papers back in the folder and closed it, careful with the spine. My reflection in the desk glass looked like a man listening to the ocean from far away. "We will not incorporate these," I said. "Not today." "Of course," Silver murmured, relief and discomfort wrestling behind his glasses. "We can revisit." "We won't," I said, and I did not smile. My daughter had prepared the puzzle. She had arranged the edges. She had made room in the box for a picture without me in it, and she thought I would be grateful for the neatness. In the hallway, the air smelled of hot paper and citrus cleaner, and the elevators dinged with the cheerfulness of a lie that has not yet been caught. I took the stairs, one careful step after another, a man counting backward. I would sign nothing until I watched her show me how far she was willing to go. That thought followed me down the narrow stairwell. the echo of my own shoes sounding like someone else was keeping pace behind me. Outside, Miami's heat wrapped itself around my neck, the air heavy with the metallic tang that comes before a storm breaks for real. I didn't head home. I drove north instead, letting the afternoon traffic funnel me toward the marina. The roads shimmered and the scent of salt mixed with the sharp sweetness of sunscreen from beachgoers crossing in front of me. My old sedan hummed like it was whispering secrets to itself. I'd kept it all these years because it reminded me of a time when everything I owned couldn't be stolen with a pen. At the marina, I found a bench under a leaning palm and sat with my back to the water. I didn't trust the horizon. I needed the view of the street to see who might be coming. That's when I saw her car, a polished silver coupe she'd bought last spring, the kind that announces itself long before it parks. She got out wearing that precise shade of coral lipstick that didn't exist when she was growing up, but looked like it had been waiting for her all along. She spotted me before I could pretend not to notice. "Dad," she called, her tone the practiced warmth you reserve for audiences, not fathers. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said, watching the way her eyes darted briefly to the fishing boats, then back to me. "I was nearby," she lied. The air, her perfume, something expensive, sharp at first, then soft, like an apology that comes too late. She sat beside me without asking, crossing her legs so the gold clasp on her sandal caught the sun. "I went to see Mr. Silver yesterday," she began, her gaze fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. I let her speak. "It's just, things need to be in order," she continued, her voice slowing as if she were explaining to a child why the rules exist. "You wouldn't want confusion or disputes." That was when I noticed a small shift in her tone, something rehearsed giving way to something almost pleading. "Confusion for whom?" I asked. "For everyone," she said quickly. "For the family." The word family sat between us like a coin neither of us wanted to pick up. She was thinking of my savings, my house, my accounts, pieces of my life turned into chips at a table she was already dealing. I could have accused her then, made the air sharp enough to cut, but I wanted her to keep talking. People tell you more when they believe you're almost convinced. "You've worked so hard," she added. "It's only right to make sure it goes to someone who will protect it." "Protect it from what?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when the answer doesn't matter, as long as the signature does. Her phone buzzed in her bag, and she glanced at it just long enough for me to see a name I didn't recognize, Garrison. She silenced it without comment, but her hand lingered on the clasp as if it were a talisman. I stood. "Walk with me," I said. We moved along the boardwalk, the wood planks groaning under our steps. Boats shifted in their slips, their rigging clinking like wind chimes. She talked about the heat, the tourists, a restaurant she wanted to try, anything but the will. But I could feel the weight of it in her stride, the way she kept half a step ahead of me, like someone leading a tour through a house they already own. At the end of the pier, I stopped and leaned on the railing. The water below was dark and restless, the surface broken by flashes of silver as fish darted in and out of the light. "I'm not ready to sign anything," I said finally. Her lips pressed together, and in that stillness I caught a flicker of calculation, quick as a fish breaking water. She didn't argue. She just nodded once and said, "We'll talk again." She walked back toward her car, her sandals striking the boards with the rhythm of someone counting steps. I stayed where I was, watching the tide shift beneath me, wondering how many tides would pass before she decided talking wasn't enough. The answer came sooner than the dark, as if the bay itself had decided to stop pretending there was time left. I drove home with the windows cracked so the damp air could rinse the office smell from my shirt. The sky over Biscayne Boulevard had that bruised curtain. My block was quiet the way a room is quiet after chairs have been moved back into place. I stood on the porch a moment, palms whispering, and looked at the lock. The brass shone too cleanly for a door I had not polished in weeks. That kind of shine isn't kindness, it's a calling card. Inside, the house wore my habits like a suit that didn't quite fit. The fan in the living room was still set to the lower pull, not the middle, where I always leave it. The pitcher in the icebox was a notch forward on the shelf. The old radio was angled toward the chair I rarely sit in. Small adjustments, all invisible unless you live alone long enough to know how your life arranges itself when you're not there. On the hallway runner, a single grain of sand clung to a drop of rain that must have fallen from a sandal strap. I went straight to the desk. The ledger was where I left it, the key in the dish, the top drawer locked. My hands didn't tremble, but they remembered. I opened the drawer and found nothing obvious, just stamps, a rubber band, a brass letter opener, a small stack of blank notepads from the bank. I lifted one and ran my palm across the top page, feeling for the ghosts of pressure. Halfway down the second page, a signature rose under the light, the way a bruise declares itself a day after the blow. My name, practiced in a hand that copied rather than wrote. The loops near perfect, the tail of the last letter too proud. That was when I knew the conversation by the water had not been a prelude but a mid-act turn, and the play I thought we were in had already moved to a new scene. I put the pad back and shut the drawer. The doorbell did not ring. Instead, there was a soft knock on the frame near the kitchen, 3 spaced taps, the rhythm of someone who believes doors exist to be answered for them. "Evening, Mr. Green," said Alvarez from next door, his hat in his hand, though he never wore it. "Saw your girl earlier. Wanted to check you're all right." "What time?" I asked. "Near lunchtime," he said. "She left with a folder, smiled like she meant it." Alvarez had the kindness of men who mind their own business with their eyes open. He glanced toward the hall. "Storm's coming." "It always is," I said. He took his leave, and the house exhaled. The mid-afternoon heat had seeped into the walls. Every surface felt like a hand held too long. I didn't turn on the lights yet. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the street tilt into evening, thinking of small things. A corner piece slipped into the wrong puzzle, a child's jaw clamped when the picture refuses to behave. I pictured a name I had glimpsed on her buzzing phone, Garrison, and rolled it in my mouth like a hard seed. The name fit poorly with any friend I knew, and too well with the type of man who calls other men sir while selling them the same net twice. I moved through the rooms with deliberate slowness, taking inventory the way you do after a storm pretends to pass. In my bedroom, the wardrobe doors were closed but not flush. A hem of air showed between them like a tongue caught under teeth. Inside, the box of papers sat square on the shelf, the dust disturbed in a neat crescent. I opened it and found everything intact, and one thing added. A single page of draft language about expeditious administration, clipped from some pamphlet and slipped under the top layer like a planted seed. That was the minor correction I had not anticipated. She wasn't only rearranging, she was leaving me explanations to find, small breadcrumbs meant to make me believe order could be kind. I carried the box to the dining table and laid out a decoy. I chose an old form with a heading that looked official enough to tempt, and I left a blank where a signature would land if someone were eager. I tilted the lamp to throw a little theater onto the paper and set the pen beside it, heavy and familiar, the way a key waits under a rock everyone knows about. Outside, thunder rolled closer, slow and certain, and the palms bowed as if to make room for something larger than weather. I listened to the house hold its breath, and I listened to my own. I would not chase. I would watch. I would measure the step, the timing, the patience that announces intent before it touches ink. I left the lamp burning over the empty signature line and waited for the first shadow to move. That light became a lighthouse in the small hours, casting its pale circle on the table, waiting for a ship I knew was already in the harbor. I sat in the living room with the curtains drawn just enough to see the street. Midnight in Miami has its own kind of heat, thicker, more patient. The crickets worked in steady rhythm, And somewhere down the block, a television murmured the sounds of laughter that didn't belong to anyone I knew. My old clock ticked, and each tick was a nail in the slow construction of whatever my daughter believed she was building. Around 1, the first set of headlights slowed outside. Not her coupe. This was an older sedan, paint dull, engine whispering like a cat in tall grass. It paused long enough for someone inside to watch the house before pulling away. I didn't move. The real thing never comes first. At 2:30 I heard it, the faint scrape of the back gate latch. The gate never sits right in its hinge, and only 2 kinds of people open it in the dark: neighbors chasing a stray and people who have no business here. I kept my breathing steady as footsteps crossed the yard. The kitchen door didn't rattle. The lock turned. A shadow passed across the hallway, the weight of it light, deliberate. I could hear the faint exhale of someone holding their own breath too long. The dining room chair moved, just enough to clear the way to the table. The pen shifted. There was a pause, then the sound of paper against paper as the decoy form was examined. That's when the midnight hook snapped taut. I recognized the perfume before the face, the same coral sharp sweetness from the marina, only fainter now, diluted by the smell of damp clothes. My daughter wasn't alone. A second set of steps came from behind her, heavier, impatient, the kind of step that belonged to a man who made his living taking what others didn't guard well enough. "Here," she whispered. "No name," the man replied, voice low but not low enough. I stayed in the dark, letting the scene play its full hand. She laid the paper flat, tapped the pen once. "He'll think he did it himself," she murmured. That was the minor twist I hadn't accounted for. She didn't plan to present the papers to me. She planned to present them as if I had already signed. My memory clouded, my consent implied. The man, Garrison, I was sure now, took the pen, but he didn't sign. He studied the room instead, his eyes landing briefly on the hallway where I stood just beyond the reach of the lamplight. For a moment I thought he could see me, but his gaze moved on. He slid the paper back. "Not tonight. Too much light." They left as quietly as they'd come, her sandals soft on the tile, his shoes swallowing the sound. The gate clicked once, twice, then silence. I stayed still another 10 minutes, listening for the sound of their car. When it came, it was fast, too fast for the narrow street. In the glow of the dining room lamp, the paper lay untouched, but the pen had rolled slightly toward the edge, as if something had tried to take it with them. I moved it back, slow, deliberate. The weight of it felt different now, less a tool, more a piece in a longer game. I knew then that this was no longer about inheritance. It was about erasure, about rearranging the record so the past became negotiable. She wanted not just the money, but the right to decide I had agreed to give it to her. I turned off the lamp. The house settled around me, the night sealing up its brief opening. I would need to move before they did. In the darkness, the puzzle of her next move began to take shape in my mind, and I knew the picture would not be pretty. Dawn arrived like a verdict, thin and gray, laying its long finger across the table where the empty line waited for a name that wasn't coming. I boiled coffee I didn't want and drank it standing, the kitchen tile cool against my bare feet, the storm-wet air pressing at the screens. The house smelled faintly of old citrus and lamp oil. I folded the decoy form and slid it back into the box, then dressed in the careful way of men who intend to be underestimated. By 7, the sidewalks were sweating, and the first buses hissed past like tired animals. I locked the door, testing it twice, and set out on foot because wheels can think for you, and I needed to hear my thoughts. The clerk's office lived in a building that always felt older than its paint, where the fans worked harder than the men, and the men pretended not to. Notice. Inside, the line curled like a patient snake. I took a number and watched the counter as if the red digits could tell me the future. When it was my turn, I asked for public records connected to my name. Recent filings, anything with a scent of urgency. The woman behind the glass had a voice like crushed paper and eyes that missed nothing. "Plenty of folks don't check these until it's too late," she said, sliding a stack toward me. Halfway through, the hinge turned. There it was. A durable power of attorney, filed 2 days earlier, my name spelled correctly, my signature almost virtuous in its imitation. The ink showed no hesitation, only conceit. 2 witnesses, one unfamiliar, the other made my mouth go dry. The initials at the bottom were small and neat, the way he kept his desk. M.S. That was when the room seemed to tilt, and the air took on the scent of the office where I had not sat. "Everything all right?" the woman asked, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. "Clerical curiosity," I said, folding the paper so my hands wouldn't betray me. Outside, the sun had started its bright interrogation. I walked the 3 blocks to Mr. Silver's suite, each step measuring the space between astonishment and anger. The elevator sized me up, and I knocked once before letting myself in. He was alone, sleeves rolled, spectacles low on his nose, a ledger balanced on his knee like a cat that wouldn't leave. "We need to talk," I said. He set the book aside with care, as if rough movement could bruise numbers. "If this is about yesterday, it's about 2 days ago." I placed the copy of the filing on his desk. "Explain how your initials wandered onto a document I never saw." His eyes flicked to the page and back to me. No lightning, just the cloud shadow of a man calculating which truth would cost him less. "She called," he said. "Said you were unwell. Said you asked for expedience." "Said," I repeated, tasting each letter. "I went to the house," he added quickly. "The curtains were drawn. A gentleman, her associate, met me at the door. He presented you as resting in the next room. I never saw you, but—" He lifted his hands, and the hangman's rope between sentences was silence. That was when the midpoint shifted under me. This wasn't only deception, it was a performance staged in my absence, with my consent played by a closed door. "Do you truly believe I signed that?" I asked. He swallowed. "I believe I wanted to believe her. It seemed kind." "Kindness likes the dark," I said, and the word tasted of damp curtains and a pen that moved too smoothly. He straightened the paper until its corners were perfect. "We can contest," he said softly. "We can undo." "We will," I said, "but not from behind this desk." I left him there with his tidy guilt and walked back into the heat that wanted everything. The city had settled into its morning rhythm, vendors pulling awnings, hoses hissing, tires whispering secrets across wet asphalt. I felt old in the useful way. Age is a lever when you remember where to place it. At the bank, the marble floor kept last night's cool like a promise it hadn't decided whether to keep. I asked to see the manager, a man I knew well enough to dislike. He sat me down in an office that smelled of carpet glue and ambition. I told him plainly that no disbursement, transfer, or signature from my name would be honored without my face attached to it. He nodded too quickly, as if agreement were the same as attention. "Just yesterday," he said, trying to be casual, "your representative inquired about consolidating accounts." "Describe my representative," I said. "Tall, neat suit, carried himself like he expected yes," he hesitated. "Introduced as your son-in-law." I smiled without showing teeth. My daughter had never married. That title was borrowed for the evening like a jacket you plan to return only if the party disappoints. By noon, the heat had burned the last of the storm smell from the air. I walked home slower than before, stopping for nothing, weighing what could be spared and what must be defended. I was done reacting. The next move would be mine, not as a father, but as a man narrowing a door. When I reached my porch, a white envelope waited under the mat, turned face down as if ashamed of its own purpose, and I knew the game had just stepped into my house without knocking. I didn't touch it right away. Paper has a temperature. If you rush, you miss what it's telling you. I bent down slowly, feeling the boards under my feet shift with the weight. The envelope was cool, too cool for the noon heat, which meant it hadn't been there long. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table without flipping it over. I poured water from the pitcher, drank, and waited for my pulse to match the clock. Only then did I slide a finger under the flap. The paper inside was crisp and smelled faintly of cedar, as though it had spent the night in a desk drawer that belonged to someone who cared about appearances. Typed lines marched down the page, formal language, legal posture, but my eyes went straight to the bottom, where her name was printed in a neat, deliberate hand. It wasn't a letter, it was a notice. She had filed a petition for guardianship, citing concerns for mental competence and irregular decision-making behaviors. My breath came slow, but my knuckles tightened until the edges of the paper curled. This wasn't theft anymore. This was a declaration that I no longer owned myself. Halfway through reading, the mid-hook struck. A name appeared halfway down the second paragraph, Garrison, listed as interim financial custodian. I didn't need the law degree I never earned to know what that meant. She was building a cage, and he had the keys. The air in the room thickened. I set that notice down and looked at the window, where sunlight fractured across the glass like it was trying to escape. I thought of my daughter's face when she was 10, the night she lied about breaking her mother's watch. She had looked almost sorry then, but her eyes had been bright with the thrill of getting close to the line. Now there was no line, only a field she believed she could walk across without anyone stopping her. I didn't bother calling Silver this time. I knew he'd respond with that slow, wounded tone of a man caught between his conscience and his comfort. Instead, I walked to the back room where I kept the safe, the combination dial worn smooth from years of use. Inside were things she didn't know existed. The original deed to the house, my war bonds, the handwritten will from 20 years ago before any lawyer touched it, and, most importantly, the sealed envelope containing the updated one I had written myself, witnessed by 2 friends she'd never met. I spread the documents out on the desk. The will left her nothing but my tools and the record player she hated. Everything else went to friends, charities, and a few old debts I wanted to see paid before I disappeared. Looking at it now, I felt the same calm I'd felt when I wrote it. The satisfaction of building something no one could twist without tearing it in half. The sound of gravel crunching outside pulled me back. I moved to the window in time to see her silver coupe pull into the driveway. She didn't get out right away. She sat there, one hand on the wheel, the other scrolling through her phone, her face unreadable in the glare. When she finally stepped out, she carried nothing but her bag, the clasp glinting like it had that day at the marina. She knocked twice, polite but firm, then let herself in before I answered. "We need to talk," she said, her voice too level for the heat outside. I gestured toward the table, where her guardianship petition lay unfolded. She glanced at it, then at me, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't pretend to be surprised. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "Hard things tend to last longer," I replied. Her lips tightened, and her eyes shifted to the back room. I followed her gaze, not with my body, but with the cold certainty that she already knew where the safe was. She smiled then, not wide, not friendly, but with the calm of someone convinced they've already won. In that moment, I understood. She hadn't come to negotiate. She had come to measure the distance between her hand and the lock. The room held its breath with me, the afternoon light laying a thin blade across the floor between us. She set her bag on the chair without breaking eye contact. "You look tired," she said, the way a nurse might say it before tightening a strap. The sound gave me time to think. When I turned back, she had drifted halfway down the hall, pretending to study the family photographs, as if history were a wallpaper that could be stripped off with steam. "You filed it," I said, nodding toward the guardianship notice on the table. "You put my name on a leash." "It's a safeguard," she answered, voice calm enough to pass inspection. "You've been scattered, forgetting things." "Things like refusing to sign?" I asked. She smiled with only one side of her mouth. "You taught me to prepare for storms." We both turned our faces toward the back room as if summoned. The air there felt cooler, the way a church feels cooler even in summer. She paused at the door, fingers brushing the paint where the latch once stuck when she was a girl. "Do you still use the same combination?" she asked lightly, as if inquiring about a favorite song. "That depends," I said, keeping my tone even. "Do you still think in threes?" At the midpoint, the mask slipped a fraction. "I remember the way your hand moved," she said, eyes on the dial that wasn't yet in her grasp. "Left, right, left, like dancing with a woman who won't forgive you." She had been watching me for years, I realized, not just the man I was, but the small, private choreography of survival. That recognition settled like a coin in my pocket, cold, valuable, and heavier than it looked. We stood quiet long enough to hear a gull scold the empty sky. She walked back to the kitchen and pulled out a chair. "Sit," she said. It sounded like an invitation. It landed like a command. I remained standing. "Who is Garrison?" "A helper," she said. "Someone who understands paperwork." "Someone who understands removing men from their names," I corrected. She folded her hands. The gold clasp on her bag caught a patch of sun and sent it skittering across the table like a small, fleeing animal. "Debts accrue," she said too casually. "Interest does not care for sentiment." That was when the middle shifted under my feet. "What debts?" I asked. "Yours," she said, and those 4 letters changed the temperature of the room. "A line of credit you opened last year, a bridge loan for home improvements you never finished, consolidation fees, late penalties. It's all very dull." "Dull," I repeated, because the alternative was laughter. "And whose signature woke up those dollars?" "Why argue details?" she replied, and the edge in her voice finally showed. "You plan to give everything away? I plan to protect it from your impulses." A small, precise rage rose in me, the kind that doesn't shake the glass, only clears it. I walked to the dining table and opened the safe envelope, careful not to touch the ink on the freshly notarized pages within. "There are witnesses you do not know." She didn't bother to look. "Courts are slow," she said. "Emergencies are fast." At 75% of the hour, the twist arrived not with thunder, but with a quiet click. The front door latch eased open and a shadow stepped over the threshold. Garrison did not introduce himself. He removed his hat as if my house were a stage and set it on the sideboard like a prop he trusted. "Afternoon," he said to the air. "You are not invited," I said. "I am wherever the paperwork is," he answered, eyes finding the back room without moving his head. His voice carried the memorized politeness of a man taught to pass as respectable until the moment respect gets in the way. My daughter didn't flinch. "We'll be quick," she told him, as if speed could soften theft. I moved first, not toward the safe, but toward the front window, where Alvarez's hibiscus leaned over my porch rail like a witness with a good memory. "Neighbors know my routines," I said. "They know I don't entertain at noon." Garrison's jaw worked once. "Then we'll be neighbors too," he said. I stepped between them and the hallway. "You will leave," I said, not loudly, but with the weight of a man who has counted every board in his own floor. "And you will tell whatever judge you've summoned that the man you claim to shelter can still lock his own door. Or," my daughter said softly, "a judge will see a confused old man blocking access to his own safety." I watched her choose the words, watched her place them like careful stones across a stream. She believed there was no current strong enough to take her footing. "You mistake me," I said. "I am not blocking. I am measuring." She tilted her head. "Measuring what?" "How much of you is left," I said, "that is still my child." Garrison reached for the bag. The gold clasp flashed again, brief as lightning at sea, and I understood that the moment to be careful had ended.
That glint was my signal, the same way sailors once read the flash of a lighthouse, not as welcome, but as warning. I stepped toward the bag before Garrison's fingers could close around it. My hand landed on the leather first, flat and steady, and I felt the faint warmth from her palm still clinging to it. Her eyes narrowed, not from fear, but from irritation, like a card player whose opponent just spoiled a perfect hand. "You'll hurt yourself," she said, her voice a measured blend of concern and mockery. "You've mistaken the weight of this," I replied, sliding the bag across the table toward me. "It's not heavy with what you think it is." Garrison shifted his stance, the heel of one shoe squeaking against the tile. "I don't want trouble, Mr. Green," he said, though the way his hand flexed suggested otherwise. "Then take your hand off my floor," I told him, my voice level, my eyes locked on his.
Silence could be sharper than shouting, and the air between us turned thin and brittle. Her gaze flicked between us, and I saw the calculation in her pupils, the silent math of risk and gain. At the midpoint, she spoke without looking at me. "We could still do this quietly. You know how public hearings drain a man." "They drain liars faster," I said. That was when I noticed something I should have caught sooner. The bag was too light. Whatever I thought might be inside wasn't. She hadn't come for the safe today. She'd come to measure me, just as I had measured her, and maybe to leave something behind. I placed the bag on the counter and opened it slowly. Inside was a manila envelope, unsealed. I slid the papers out. Not court filings this time, photocopies of my medical records, years old but stamped in red. Cognitive decline, further evaluation recommended. The dates were doctored, the signatures traced. Garrison didn't move, but I saw his reflection in the window glass, his jaw tightening, his eyes not on me, but on her. Maybe he hadn't known about this part. "Your handwriting's improved," I told her, setting the papers down. "Doctors' hands shake sometimes," she answered, unbothered. "It doesn't make the diagnosis less true." Here came the twist, not in her words, but in his. "You didn't say anything about this." His voice had lost its polish. She turned on him. "You wanted quick results. This is how you get them." I saw my opening. "Seems your partner's having second thoughts," I said, letting the words hang. Doubt is a dangerous thing in joint ventures. Her lips pressed into a flat line. "He's not my partner." The denial was sharp, but it didn't close the gap that had just opened between them. Garrison's eyes were already elsewhere, as if weighing whether his involvement was worth the paper trail now in my hands. I gathered the forged records, folded them twice, and slipped them into my own pocket. "You've brought me something useful," I said. "Thank you for the delivery." She reached for the bag, but I didn't let go until I saw the flicker of frustration. "We're not done," she said. "No," I agreed, "but the next move is mine." Without another word, Garrison stepped back toward the door. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to leave with him or stand her ground. In the end, she followed, the clasp on her bag catching the light one last time before the door closed behind her. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. It was the pause in a chess game where both players realize the board is smaller than they thought. I walked to the safe, spun the dial, and took out the sealed envelope containing my true will. If they were going to use forgery, then I would use absence. The will would vanish somewhere they couldn't reach, because paper, like people, has a way of disappearing when danger comes knocking. I wrapped it in waxed cloth, the kind sailors use to keep maps dry, and slid it into the hollow of an old fishing rod case. That case had been leaning in the corner of my back room for decades, invisible to anyone who didn't know the story of the tarpon I never caught. The next morning, I carried it to the marina before the sun had climbed over the hotels. The dock planks were slick with night's condensation, and the air smelled of diesel and salt. Alvarez was already there, mending a net, his fingers quick despite the stiffness in his knuckles. "Going fishing?" he asked without looking up. "Just putting something where the tide can't touch it," I said. He gave me the kind of nod that means a man has decided not to know more than you tell him. I stowed the case in the storage compartment of his skiff, beneath a crate of rusted tools that no thief would bother to lift. By the time I walked back home, the city was stirring, bakery air drifting from the corner, buses sighing to their stops. My front porch was empty this time, but the lock felt warmer than it should have, as if recently turned. Inside, nothing was out of place at first glance, but my desk chair was pulled 2 inches back from where I leave it, and the ledger in the top drawer had been rotated 90 degrees. The intrusion wasn't about finding. It was about telling me they could enter whenever they pleased. Midway through checking the rooms, I found the real message. In the kitchen, on the table where her guardianship petition had lain, there was now a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Not bent, not dirty, just placed dead center, face up. I stood over it, the image pulling at an old memory. Years ago, when she was barely 12, we'd played poker with matchsticks on rainy afternoons. She'd called the Queen of Spades the Widow and said it was the card you held back until everyone thought they'd won. Now it was here, waiting for me, a private language turned into a warning. I slipped the card into my breast pocket. If she wanted to speak in symbols, I could answer in kind. That afternoon, I went to the county recorder's office and filed a change of address for all my official correspondence, not to my home, but to a P.O. box registered under Alvarez's name. It was a small move, but it would buy me a layer of fog. When I returned, I found Garrison sitting on my porch steps, sleeves rolled, a paper cup of coffee cooling beside him. "You walk a lot for an old man," he said, as if the fact was a personal inconvenience. "Better than sitting still and letting people rearrange my furniture," I replied. He leaned back, stretching his legs. "You've got a stubborn streak. She's worried about you." "She's worried about my assets," I corrected. For the first time, he didn't deny it. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me, the way a man studies a lot. "Over control now. Keep the house, the car, live out your days without a fight." "And what happens when my days outlast your patience?" I asked. He didn't answer. He finished his coffee, stood, and walked toward his car without another word. But as he reached the door, he paused. "She's not the only one in this," he said over his shoulder. "And not everyone has her patience." The way he said it told me my circle of enemies had just grown wider than blood. I watched him drive off, the exhaust curling in the heat, and I knew the game had shifted. They weren't just coming for the will anymore, they were circling for the man who wrote it. That truth settled in my chest like a weight I'd been carrying for years without noticing, the kind that changes how you stand and breathe. I locked the front door and drew the blinds, not out of fear, but to make the house deaf to the street. I needed the kind of quiet where thoughts could be counted and placed in order, like ammunition before a hunt. The phone rang once, sharp in the stillness. No name on the display, just a number that carried no memory. I let it ring twice more before lifting the receiver. A man's voice, smooth as glass. "Mr. Green, we understand you've been making adjustments." "I make coffee in the morning. I adjust the fan speed at night. Everything else is noise," I said. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Noise can be silenced. We'd prefer not to." "You're not Garrison," I said. "No," he replied. "Garrison's a door. I'm the one who steps through." The call ended before I could place the timbre of his voice, but it left behind the scent of an open window in a locked room. Wrong, unsettling, deliberate. Midday found me on Alvarez's porch, the fishing rod case still hidden in his skiff. He handed me a cold bottle of soda and asked no questions, which was the right kind of loyalty. But even his eyes carried a question he didn't voice. "How far will you go?" "Far enough," I said quietly, though whether I meant for the will or for myself, I wasn't sure. Back home, I found the next move waiting for me on my own turf. A black sedan was parked across the street, its windows up despite the heat. The driver didn't look at me when I stepped onto the porch. He just lifted his phone, took a single photo, and drove away. It was a message without words. We see you, we record you, we wait. At the midpoint, I opened the safe again, not for the will, but for something older. A small revolver, nickel finish dulled by years of drawer air, lay wrapped in an oilcloth. My father had given it to me when I left home at 19, saying only, "Not for fear, for certainty." I checked the cylinder, closed it with a firm click, and set it on the nightstand. As the afternoon light turned the walls amber, I sat at the desk and began writing. Not a will, letters. One to Alvarez, one to an old friend in Tampa, one to the lawyer who had drawn up my first testament before my daughter knew how to spell her own name. Each one explained, in plain words, the sequence of events, the names, the dates, the attempts. I sealed them in separate envelopes and left them in different hiding spots around the house. If they came for me, my words would scatter like seeds. Just after sunset, there was a knock at the door. Not the quick rap of neighbors or the heavy fist of Garrison. This was measured. 3 beats, then silence. I opened it to find a boy no older than 15 holding a small cardboard box. "From the lady," he said, thrusting it into my hands before running back to the street. Inside was a single object, the Queen of Spades, this time scorched at the edges, the burn pattern neat and controlled. On the back, in her handwriting, were 4 words: "Last chance to yield." I set the card down on the table, the burnt edge smudging a faint mark on the wood. There was no anger in me now, no surprise, only a cold precision settling in. They wanted the man who wrote the will. They would find him. Ready. Readiness, I've learned, isn't about weapons or walls. It's about removing the places your enemies expect you to stand. I began with the house. Every drawer, every shelf, every hollow space became a different version of itself. The revolver moved from the nightstand to the pantry, concealed in a jar with a false bottom. Important documents were split into pieces, each stowed in an envelope that, on the outside, read something so boring no one would look twice. Grocery receipts, 1994 to 1998, property tax notices, boat maintenance logs. By morning, the place looked lived in, but not lived with. The first move of the day came from them. A courier van pulled up to the curb, engine idling while the driver sat smoking in the shade of the open door. He didn't ring the bell. Instead, a second man stepped out from the far side, crossed the street, and tucked something under my windshield wiper. I waited until they drove off before checking it. A folded sheet of paper, typed, clean. A date, time, and address, no explanation, no signature. The address belonged to an old warehouse near the edge of the docks, a place where salt water eats at metal faster than rust can grow. Midday, I called Alvarez. "I might need a ride later," I said. "Is this about your daughter?" he asked. "It's about her habits," I replied. At the midpoint, I sat in my kitchen with the Queen of Spades between my fingers. The burnt edge left a faint smear on my thumb. She was telling me the game had moved to its last hand. They came in 2 cars. Her silver coupe followed by a dark SUV. She stepped out first, dressed in white like a peace envoy. Garrison climbed out of the SUV, followed by 2 other men I didn't recognize. From my distance, I couldn't hear the words, but I could see her posture, shoulders back, chin high, the stance of someone certain the field is already hers. One of the unknown men unlocked the door, and they disappeared inside. I waited 5 minutes, then crossed the street. The door hadn't latched fully. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Light from the high windows painted stripes across the concrete. Voices drifted from the far end of the building. I stayed in the shadows until I could make out the shape of a table, papers spread across it, my name appearing in the bold headers of every sheet. That was when the turn hit me. This wasn't just about my will or my accounts. Among the papers were property deeds, bank ledgers, and contracts belonging to other names I didn't know. My daughter wasn't acting alone, and she wasn't the one holding the largest share of the scheme. Garrison's voice carried, "We get his consent on tape, it's over. Doesn't matter if it's real. Courts see the footage, they see the signature, they close the file." Her reply was colder than I'd ever heard it. "Then let's get him here." I stepped back, careful not to disturb the dust. The warehouse had become a stage, and I was expected to walk into the spotlight willingly. Leaving the way I came, I knew one thing for certain. The man they wanted to trap in that room was already gone. I'd play my part, but it would be in a script they didn't write. That decision was the first solid ground I'd felt under my feet in weeks, and I intended to keep it. I spent the night building my own scene. No lights, no stage, but the same principles applied. You control the audience by controlling what they can't see. The kitchen became my prop room. The revolver stayed within reach, tucked inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the counter. The forged medical records were spread across the table, annotated in my handwriting with dates and names they'd rather never be spoken aloud. By morning, I'd decided on my entrance. I called Alvarez and told him to meet me 2 blocks from the warehouse at the same time they'd summoned me. I brought nothing but the clothes on my back, the Queen of Spades in my pocket, and a voice recorder no bigger than a matchbox pinned inside my shirt. The streets near the docks were quieter than usual, the air heavy with the smell of rain trapped in rust. I approached on foot, watching the warehouse from a distance. Their 2 cars were already there, parked at angles that spoke of ownership. When I stepped inside, all 4 of them were waiting. My daughter in her white suit, Garrison beside her, the 2 unknown men flanking the...
Now, a camera sat on a tripod, its red light blinking steadily.
"You came," she said, as if it were a kindness. "I was invited," I answered. The taller of the strangers gestured toward a chair. "Let's make this easy." I didn't sit. "Easy for who?" "For everyone," my daughter said, her voice smooth but her eyes already scanning for the folder I didn't bring. Halfway through the exchange, I set my own mid-game hook. I reached into my pocket and placed the Queen of Spades on the table. "You taught me this card's lesson yourself," I said. "You keep it hidden until you know it will hurt the most." She didn't touch it. "We're wasting time," Garrison muttered, moving to adjust the camera. I leaned forward, just enough to make my words carry into its microphone. "This is a criminal conspiracy. My signature has been forged. My records have been falsified. My daughter is attempting to secure guardianship for financial gain aided by these 3 men." The taller stranger laughed. "That's not how this works, old man." "That's exactly how this works," I said, "because I'm not here to sign anything. I'm here to make sure you keep talking." Her face flickered, not fear, but the sudden realization that the script was no longer hers. She reached to switch off the camera, but Garrison hesitated, his eyes narrowing at me. "Why bother?" he said. "We can edit." I smiled, just enough for him to see the glint of the recorder clipped under my shirt. "You'd be surprised where the unedited version's going." The room changed temperature. One of the strangers stepped toward me, but my voice cut through the space before his foot landed. "Take one more step and every name on those papers goes to the district attorney by sunrise." For a long moment, no one moved. Then my daughter exhaled, slow and measured. "You think you've won something," she said. "I've won my place in the story," I replied, "and I've made sure you don't control the ending." She gathered the papers without looking at me, slid them into a folder and turned for the door. Garrison followed, silent. The 2 strangers lingered a moment, then left without a word. When the warehouse was empty, I picked up the Queen of Spades, slipped it back into my pocket, and stepped out into the daylight. The tide was shifting, and I could feel the pull toward something bigger than our family's fight, a current that would either carry me clear or drag me under. The air outside the warehouse had that damp heaviness before a storm, thick enough to cling to the skin. I walked the length of the pier without looking back, knowing the game had just climbed into a new league. I didn't go home. Instead, I cut through the back streets to a diner that smelled of fried onions and bleach, a place where conversations were short and eyes stayed in their coffee cups. I slid into a booth at the far wall, facing the door, the Queen of Spades resting under my palm like a private flag. The waitress poured my coffee without asking. "Rough day?" she said, voice flat, eyes already on the next table. "Just deciding which storm to walk into," I replied. While the cup cooled, I pulled the tiny recorder from my shirt and rewound it. Every word from the warehouse played back in its tinny truth, their voices, their admissions, their confidence before they realized the script had changed. I smiled at the sound of my daughter's hesitation. Hesitation was always the first crack in her armor. Midway through the second playback, I noticed a reflection in the chrome napkin holder. A man had just stepped inside, pausing at the counter like he was deciding between pie and trouble. He didn't order. His eyes swept the room once, and when they landed on me, he moved toward the booth. "You left too soon," he said, sliding into the seat across from me without invitation. He was one of the strangers from the warehouse, shorter than I remembered, his suit jacket smelling faintly of rain and tobacco. I didn't touch my coffee. "I leave when I'm done." He glanced around the diner, then leaned in. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Then tell me," I said, keeping my voice low. "That wasn't just her game," he said. "She's just the piece that fits. There's a bigger table. Real money, real influence, and they don't like their business dragged into daylight." I let the silence draw him out. "You walk away," he continued. "You keep your house, your pension, maybe even your will stays intact. But if you push this, if you send whatever you've got, people will start disappearing. Maybe you." I watched his eyes as he spoke. They didn't have the heat of a threat, just the dull certainty of a man delivering someone else's message. "Your mistake," I said finally, "is thinking I'm afraid of disappearing." He shook his head, slid out of the booth, and left without touching his coffee. I finished mine slowly, watching the rain start against the windows. The diner's neon sign flickered in the puddles, breaking into shards of red and blue. The pull of the current was stronger now, and I knew the next move had to happen before the tide went out completely. When I stepped back outside, Alvarez's truck was parked across the street. He rolled down the window. "Got your package in the skiff. Want it back?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'll need it soon." We drove in silence for a while, the wipers beating time against the windshield. Finally, Alvarez spoke. "You're aiming to end this, aren't you?" "I'm aiming to change the ending," I said, "and that means making sure they think they've already won." As we passed the turn from my street, I saw a black sedan idling 2 houses
Because if the tide was pulling me, I intended to let it, straight into the heart of whatever table they were playing at so I could turn it over from the inside. That meant stepping into their world without a trace of hesitation, letting them believe I'd traded my convictions for survival. 2 nights later, I made the first move. I called my daughter from the payphone outside a laundromat, the kind of place where the hum of dryers covers every word. She answered on the second ring, her tone clipped, like someone expecting a report rather than a conversation. "I'm ready to talk," I said. A pause, just long enough for the hook to sink. "Where?" she asked. "You choose," I told her. "Neutral ground, somewhere we can speak without interruptions." She named a high-rise downtown, a place with a lobby full of marble and security cameras, her version of safe. I agreed. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in a chair that faced the elevators. She rose with that careful grace she wore in public, extending a hand as though we were nothing more than cordial strangers. "You've had time to think," she said. "I've had time to see the bigger picture," I replied, letting my eyes drift toward the corner where a man in a dark suit pretended to read a newspaper. Midway through the exchange, I let my first feint show. If there's a table, I want a seat at it. No scraps, no leash. I'm in or I'm gone. She studied me for a moment, then glanced toward the man with the paper. He folded it neatly and stood. "Let's go upstairs," he said. The elevator took us to the 23rd floor, where the carpet muted every footstep and the air smelled faintly of leather and dust. A conference room waited at the end of the hall. Long table, city lights beyond the glass. 3 other men were already seated, one of them the stranger from the diner. "This is Mr. Green," my daughter said, her voice carrying both introduction and endorsement. They spoke in turns, each man weighing his words like chips on a table. The talk was about assets, transitions, and protective oversight, the same lies dressed in more expensive clothing. Then came the twist. One of the men slid a folder toward me. Inside was a document not for guardianship or power of attorney, but for a trust, a structure that would outlive me, placing every asset in their control in exchange for a tidy monthly allowance. My daughter would be named as managing beneficiary, but the fine print made clear she'd be little more than their figurehead. "They've been using you," I said to her, letting my voice cut through the room. Her jaw tightened. "And you think you can protect me from them?" "No," I said. "I can make sure they never touch what I haven't already given away." The man from the diner laughed softly. "You think you've got leverage?" I reached into my coat and placed a small padded envelope on the table. Inside were copies, medical forgeries, forged signatures, audio transcripts from the warehouse. "Enough to start a fire in every courtroom from here to Tallahassee," I said. For a moment, the room was still. Then one of the older men spoke. "And what do you want?" "Simple," I said. "You walk away from my name. You walk away from my daughter. You take nothing I've built. In return, none of this leaves my hands." My daughter stared at me, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Anger, relief, maybe both. They asked for time to discuss. I stood, slipping the Queen of Spades from my pocket and placing it on the folder. "That's my only card," I said, "and it's enough." As I walked out, I didn't look back to see who picked it up. I already knew the current had shifted again, and this time the pull was toward the shore. Whether I reached it or not was another matter. The elevator doors closed behind me with a muted thud, and the carpeted hallway swallowed my footsteps. I carried nothing in my hands, but the weight in my coat pocket felt heavier than the copies I'd left behind. It was the kind of weight you can only earn by walking out of a room where men wanted you to crawl. The night air hit me like a cool hand on a fevered brow. Miami's skyline glimmered in the distance, glass teeth catching the city lights. I walked 3 blocks before flagging down a cab. The driver didn't speak, and I was grateful for the silence. Halfway to my street, I told him to take the long way around. I wanted to see if the black sedan still lingered near my porch. It was gone, but the empty curb looked staged, like an empty chair at a table that someone intended to return to. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old citrus. I turned on no lights. Instead, I went straight to the back room, opened the safe, and retrieved the sealed will I'd hidden in Alvarez's skiff days before. The waxed cloth was still intact, smelling faintly of the sea. At the midpoint of the night, I sat at the kitchen table with the will before me. My hands didn't shake as I broke the seal, read the lines I already knew by heart, and then tore the pages neatly in half. Each strip I fed into the wood stove until the ink curled and blackened. It wasn't defeat, it was denial. Without the will, their prize was gone. Without the prize, the hunt would lose its scent. Near midnight, a soft knock came at the door. Not the measured rhythm of garrison, not the impatient hammer of strangers.
This was lighter, almost hesitant. I opened it to find my daughter standing alone, her white suit replaced by a dark coat, her hair damp from the mist. "You burned it," she said, not a question. "You left me no choice," I answered. She stepped inside, glancing around as if expecting company. "They'll still come. You think tearing up paper changes that?" "It changes the worth of the chase," I said, "and it leaves you free to decide who. You are without them." For the first time in months, her gaze softened, but it didn't last. "You think I can walk away?" "I think," I said. "You already wanted to. That's why you came alone." She looked down at her hands, then back at me. "You didn't just beat them tonight. You embarrassed them. They'll want to make an example." "I've been an example before," I said. We stood there in the low light from the street lamp, two people who had spent too long mistaking blood for loyalty. Finally, she set the Queen of Spades on the table between us. "You keep this. I'm done with the game." Her words sounded like an ending, but I knew better. In families like ours, endings are just pauses between storms. She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. I picked up the card, its edges still faintly singed, and slipped it back into my pocket. The house was silent again, but I could feel the city breathing beyond the walls, carrying with it the promise of more tides, more games, more tables to be overturned. And as I sat alone at the table, the Queen's weight in my pocket, I understood that the shore was only a temporary place to stand, because the sea always comes back.